Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I want to share a review of one specific book, something I do very rarely on this channel. That book is Out of the Shadows: 6 Visionary Victorian Women in Search of a Public Voice by Emily Midorikawa, a book published in May by Counterpoint Press. I wrote a formal review of this book for publication, but the review is available only in print, not online, so I thought I would talk about it fairly extensively here. First, let me set the scene. In 1848, a family in upstate New York spread the word that mysterious knocking frequently erupted in their home. John and Margaret Fox, along with their 2 young daughters, suggested that the noises were evidence of a ghost attempting to communicate with them. In time, the knocks suggested that the spirit had been murdered for money. Many of the adults who eventually gathered to investigate took very little notice of the presence of the 2 young girls. But soon, Kate and Maggie joined forces with their adult sister Leah to demonstrate in more public venues their ability to communicate with spirits. Participants in these sessions asked questions of their own dead relatives, and the spirits answered with a series of knocks, which the sisters helped to decode. In the Burned-Over district of upstate New York, earlier in the century, religious fervor had spread like wildfire, hence the name Burned-Over district, during the Second Great Awakening. Let me pause here to explain briefly what the Great Awakening was and to tell you a little personal story too. Basically, the First Great Awakening happened early in American history, during the 1730s and 1740s. Right around this time, Enlightenment ideas of secular rationalism had gained quite a following here in what was to become the United States. The Great Awakening was a response to that move towards a secular society. Protestant Christian leaders traveled around from town to town, promoting a kind of Christian belief that emphasized salvation. Sometimes people argue that the emphasis on showmanship, that is, charismatic performances by both preachers and by worshipers, as well as its emphasis on a direct and personal relationship with God, profoundly affected the development of American Christianity. The Second Great Awakening was quite similar, with enormous revivals occurring, especially in the North. Interestingly, this second movement was in response, at least partly, to the enormous social and economic changes that were happening in the United States because of industrialization. Part of the spread of religion here was entwined with efforts to create reform movements, dealing with the abolition of slavery, etc. Women made up a high percentage of converts in these revivals. At the same time, women found a place where they could become active in this kind of high-level moral reform of political issues. Midorikawa barely mentions this history in her book, but it's clearly absolutely an essential scaffolding that had to be erected before anything she talks about could have happened. Okay, the personal story. Back when I taught a college class, Introduction to American History, I used Great Awakening as an ID question. That is, I listed the phrase and asked my students to write a paragraph or so, very briefly explaining what the term meant and why it was important to the course. One student, a student who was doing fairly well in the class and always had interesting things to say, apparently drew a blank. She eventually wrote that the Great Awakening was a newfangled alarm clock, one that the technological advances of the period had made possible, and which the spread of capitalism allowed to spread quickly throughout the country. She even wrote about how this new emphasis on clocks and timekeeping utterly changed both personal and work lives. Instead of working on the farm by the time dictated by the sun, workers headed to factories when the town call rang out and they punched their time cards. In short, her answer to the ID question was brilliant, although totally incorrect. Sorry for that diversion. Back to the book. Still in the Burned-Over district, but a few years after the Second Great Awakening, it didn't take long before the reputed talents of the young Fox sisters began to draw large crowds, sometimes of 1,000 or more. The Fox sisters had sparked the movement that came to be known as spiritualism amidst the social and intellectual upheavals of the mid to late 19th century. The notion of a non-sectarian and accessible spirit world found fertile ground, and seances and other occult performances became a popular form of entertainment. By the 1870s, even Queen Victoria hosted a table turning where several royal ladies-in-waiting and senior courtiers held their hands along the table's edge until it mysteriously began to rotate. In Out of the Shadows, 6 visionary Victorian women in search of a public voice, Emily Bedorikawa argues that the popular spiritualism of the mid-19th century was not only a source of entertainment for audiences, but also a source of profit for many practitioners. Supernatural theater could be used to wield otherwise unthinkable levels of political and cultural clout, she says, especially for women during an era that profoundly limited their opportunities. Bedorikawa's discussion focuses on specific women spiritualists on both sides of the Atlantic, rather than on spiritualism's roots in the American Northeast. She begins with the Fox sisters' quest to share a, quote, bold new message from the spirit world. That message, this is the dawning of a new era, and you must not try to conceal it any longer, was used, Bedorikawa argues, to articulate or bolster women's rights and other radical causes. Early supporters of the Fox sisters included many progressive political activists, including suffragists and abolitionists. Perhaps these activists were drawn to spiritualism because it offered a way of attacking existing structures of authority and hierarchy. But Bedorikawa does not adequately explore that interpretive possibility. She offers a different explanation as to why so many educated people of the period, including progressive women in the Fox sisters' milieu, became adherents of a belief which, as the author says, quote, may seem unduly gullible when viewed through jaded modern eyes. The 19th century, she writes, was full of new discoveries and inventions, the mechanics of which were not understood by most people. In the 1840s, the development of the electrical telegraph allowed people for the first time to communicate almost instantaneously across previously unthinkable distances. In this period of invention and inquiry, it was not a, quote, great leap to view spirit communication in the same light as other marvels recently achieved by enterprising humans. Whether or not the women mediums actually believed in its principles themselves, spiritualism offered a way into the public sphere. Another of Bedorikawa's subjects, Emma Harding Britten, was more outspoken about her politics than the Fox sisters. After young Emma's stage career failed, she decided to write an essay ridiculing spiritualism, with the goal of earning enough money to support her mother and herself. Instead of disclosing fraud, after her investigation, Emma chose to perform as a spiritualist herself. Soon she began trance lecturing, claiming that she was reciting the words of spirit guides, such as the ghost of Benjamin Franklin. Although Emma claimed to be surprised by her boldness, these public performances, quote, had the potential to bring lucrative rewards and even fame, and this surely served as a means of enticement. It's unclear from Bedorikawa's presentation of the documentary evidence if Emma chose to engage in these performances because she was intrigued, because she wanted a political voice, or simply because she wanted attention and perhaps financial independence. After she had amassed a large following, Emma Harding Britten began to speak publicly, in a supposedly unladylike fashion, about the needs for sympathy for so-called fallen women, support for working-class women, an understanding of the economic desperation that led women to prostitution. Bedorikawa argues that Emma masked her political voice by claiming she was merely an earthly mouthpiece for the views of dead and usually male spirits. Advertising her lectures as spirit-led made it possible for Emma to adopt a response, quote, abdicating much of the responsibility for her incendiary words. Later spiritualists continued the tradition of speaking publicly about progressive issues. Victoria Woodhull, mentored by suffragists including Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, turned her fame as a medium into a run for the presidency of the United States decades before women could vote. Her proposed vice president was abolitionist Frederick Douglass, although it's unclear if he accepted. Because the presidential candidate was younger than the constitutionally mandated 35 years old, the Woodhull-Douglas ticket did not appear on the ballot. Although the British spiritualist movement was never as collectively radical as American spiritualism, with its links to abolitionist and suffragist movements, Madurakawa suggests that London practitioners did often support efforts to extend rights to working-class men and women. In Georgina Weldon's case, she almost stumbled into political activism because of her own personal circumstances. Her husband tried to institutionalize her for insanity due to her spiritualist beliefs. His accusations relied on the pamphlet Spiritualist Madness, in which the male Dr. Forbes Winslow argued that spiritualism was a primary reason that lunacy rates among women were increasing in England. Fighting for her own freedom, as well as the freedom of other wives accused of delusions, Weldon spearheaded a campaign against the lunacy laws, which allowed husbands to exert substantial control over their wives. Late in the century, some spiritualists publicly retracted claims that they could communicate with the dead. Maggie Fox staged an enormous and very profitable event to demonstrate that the knocking during Fox Sisters' performances were merely the clicking of her big toe. Madurakawa questions the truth of Fox's confession. The knocks were louder, in fact, than one might have thought possible to make with the clicking toe. Instead, even during the recantation, quote, the noises appeared to come not just from her foot, but also from behind the backdrop of the stage, the rigging above, and the galleries packed with seated onlookers. Maggie later recanted her recantation. Throughout Out of the Shadows, the author chooses to refrain from any explicit suggestion that these women might have been deceitful when performing as spiritualist mediums. Instead, she casts them primarily as public figures engaged specifically in the fight for women's liberation, a claim she cannot back up for some of the women. Madurakawa dramatically concludes that involvement in supernatural theater gave each woman, quote, a way to step decisively into the light where she could be both seen and heard. Although the author is willing to say that the women were not exactly straightforward heroines, she thinks of them as complicated primarily because they often claim to be channeling men's voices rather than speaking for themselves, not because they were committing fraud. Madurakawa gives readers a simplified and overly romantic portrayal of heroic young women bravely fighting the patriarchy during an era of intense gender-based restrictions. At no point does she consider the idea that the women's performances could have cast them, and potentially all women, as irresponsible and untrustworthy, or that their scams might have suggested that women in general were undeserving of financial independence and social power. Instead, Madurakawa states that our modern perspective, quote, might mean few readers today will trust in the feats supposedly performed by the famed mediums of the Victorian era. She argues that our contemporary view, quote, has led to spiritualism's devaluing as an historical movement of significance. This argument needn't be true. A thoughtful analysis of how spiritualism allowed women to present themselves in public, and sometimes even in political or overtly feminist roles, doesn't require us to believe that they might have had supernatural talents or to accept that those women were heroes. In an era when our society has to fight every day against fake news and the rejection of the scientific method, authors who turn their complicated historical subjects into supposedly inspirational role models and heroines are doing both them and us a disservice. Thanks for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.